There are nights when the world feels older than we remember, when the air itself seems to carry something from before cities, before empires, before the first stone was laid upon another with purpose. On such nights, if you listen carefully enough, you might sense the weight of what has been forgotten, not lost violently, not torn away, but simply released. Let go. Allowed to drift into the spaces between what we know and what we no longer ask. The clay tablets of Sumer rest in museum cases now, their wedge-shaped marks pressed into existence thousands of years ago by hands we will never know. Most speak of kings and harvests, of debts owed and boundaries claimed. But there are others. Fragments, pieces of longer works now scattered, that seem to remember something different, something quieter. They do not shout their secrets. They do not demand to be understood. They simply exist, like echoes of a conversation held in an empty room, long after the speakers have departed. What if, hidden within those ancient marks, there rests a memory of silence? Not the silence of destruction, but the silence that follows a choice, the silence of withdrawal. We have grown accustomed to stories of endings that arrive with fire and flood, with the clash of armies. We expect catastrophe to announce itself, to leave ruins dramatic enough to study, bones numerous enough to count. But perhaps there is another kind of ending, one that does not break the world but simply steps back from it, one that leaves no corpses, no burnt cities, no evidence of struggle, only the strange, unsettling quiet of spaces once inhabited, now empty. The Sumerians, those first writers of the southern plains between the two rivers, did not speak of themselves as the first people. This is worth considering. They wrote of times before their own, of ages when the world was younger and the divine walked more openly upon the earth. They called these early times the days before the flood. And in those ancient days, they remembered beings who had taught them, beings they called by many names, but who shared certain qualities in every telling. They were tall in memory, old beyond counting, and possessed of knowledge that seemed to flow from some deeper source than human discovery. These being remembered as Anunnaki in some fragments, as the seven sages in others, as the lords who came down in still different texts, were not presented as conquerors. They were not remembered as tyrants who demanded worship through fear. Instead, the oldest fragments suggest something stranger. They were teachers who spoke rarely, observers who intervened seldom, guides who pointed but did not compel. And then, if we read carefully between the wedge marks and the broken edges of clay, we find descriptions of their silence, not their destruction. There are fragments, partial, damaged their context, lost to time, that seem to describe a period when the voices of these ancient ones grew quieter, when their presence, once felt in the ordering of the seasons and the rising of the rivers, became more distant, when the knowledge they had shared began to feel like something inherited rather than something actively given. The texts do not explain why, they do not offer reasons or justifications. They simply note, in the matter-of-fact way of old record keepers, that the gods had withdrawn. Withdrawn, not vanished, not died, not been overthrown. Withdrawn. The distinction matters. To vanish suggests hourlessness, an ending imposed from without. And if we allow ourselves to consider this possibility, that what the Sumerians remembered was not the defeat of an ancient people but their departure, then the fragments begin to tell a different story, a stranger story, one that asks us to imagine a civilization so advanced, so complete in its understanding, that it chose to step back from the world it had shaped. Imagine for a moment a people who had achieved what we might call mastery. They had built cities that endured, developed agribents that worked. They had walked the earth for so long that the mountains themselves had been young when they first arrived. They had taught the early humans, those scattered tribes of hunters and gatherers, how to plant grain, how to observe the stars, how to mark time and record memory. They had done all of this, not as gods demanding worship, but as elder siblings might guide younger ones patiently from a distance, allowing room for mistakes and growth. And then, perhaps, They looked at what they had built and made a decision that we, in our striving age, can barely comprehend. Not because they had failed, not because some catastrophe forced their hand, but because they had succeeded, because the work was done, because to remain would be to prevent the very growth they had fostered. To stay would be to create dependence where they had sought to nurture independence. To linger would be to become what they had never wished to be, masters of those they had meant only to teach. So they withdrew. The Sumerian fragments that hint at this withdrawal do not describe it as sudden. There is no single moment of departure, no great farewell, no final pronouncement from on high. Instead, the text suggests a gradual fading, like twilight spreading across a landscape. The beings who had once walked openly among humans began to appear less frequently. The wisdom they had shared began to feel like distant memory rather than present instruction. The cities they had helped to raise continued, but now under human hands alone. The fields still grew, but the knowledge of their planting had become inheritance rather than gift. And the records, those careful marks pressed into wet clay, began to speak more of human kings and human achievements, and less of the old ones who had come before. Not because those risen to become forgettable, because they had stepped back far enough that human memory could begin to shape itself without their shadow. This is the silence. The fragments may remember, not the silence of the grave, but the silence of distance. Willingly embraced, the silence of a presence that recedes not, because it must, but because it chooses to. The silence of beings who understood that to truly give a gift, one must eventually let go of it completely. If we follow this thread, this whisper, carried through millennia in the wedge marks of clay, we are led to ask questions that our histories have not prepared us for. We are accustomed to asking what destroyed the old ones. We are trained to search for the catastrophe, the war, the plague, the drought that ended their time. But what if there was no such ending? What if they simply chose a different path, one that led away from the world they had known, into a silence we were never meant to break? The Sumerian texts, in their fragmentary way, seem to preserve something of this choice. They remember the withdrawal not as tragedy but as transition. They speak of it the way one might speak of a parent stepping back to let a child walk alone. When a mixture of sadness, yes, but also recognition that this is how it must be. That growth requires distance. That independence cannot be granted. It must be claimed in the space left by those who depart. And so the records fell silent. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, like a voice speaking from a room whose door slowly closes. The presence of the old ones faded from the texts. Their names remained carried forward in ritual and remembrance. But their actions ceased to fill the chronicles. The stories told of them began to take on the quality of distant memory, of traditions inherited rather than experiences lived. What remains in those oldest layers of Sumerian memory are traces of something that happened in the time between presence and absence. A period perhaps spanning generations or centuries. New fragments do not allow us to know. When the world shifted from one mode of being to another. When humanity, those younger inheritors of the river valleys, began to understand that they were now alone, not abandoned, but released, not cast out, but allowed to continue without supervision. The texts from this transitional time carry a peculiar quality. They speak of rituals performed not to summon the old ones back, but to honor their departure, of offerings made not in supplication, but in gratitude for the silence that had been given. There are descriptions, fragmentary and scattered across different tablets, of ceremonies held at dawn in empty temples, where priests would recite the names of those who had withdrawn, not asking them to return, but acknowledging that they had gone was, in some way, the texts struggle to articulate, a gift. This is not how we typically understand divine departure. We are more familiar with myths of gods who leave in anger, who punish their creations, and turn away in disgust. We know stories of deities who abandon their people as punishment, who withdraw their favor and let catastrophe follow. But the Sumerian fragments suggest something different. Now withdrawal that was neither punishment nor abandonment, but completion. A departure that said, quietly and without ceremony, "The work is done, and now it is yours. Consider what this must have felt like to those first generations who truly understood, not the desperate aloneness of abandonment, but the vast, open aloneness of possibility. The field still needed planting, and now there was no ancient hand to guide the plow. The stars still wheeled overhead, and now there was no old voice to explain their patterns. The rivers still rose and fell, and now there was no elder knowledge to predict their moods. Everything continued, but the safety of assured guidance had been withdrawn, and humanity learned, not because they had to survive catastrophe, but because they had been given space to discover. The wheat still grew, and through seasons of trial and failure, through careful observation and inherited memory, they learned its rhythms without the old ones there to correct their mistakes. The clay still held impressions, and they developed writing not as a gift directly bestowed, but as a tool they claimed and shaped to their own needs, building upon foundations that had been laid and then left for them to complete. This is what the silence may have been, for not emptiness, but space, not absence, but room for growth, that could not happen in the presence of those who already knew all the answers. The old ones in their withdrawal may have understood something profound, that true wisdom cannot be given, only discovered, that independence cannot be granted, only claimed, that humanity would never fully become itself while walking in the shadow of beings who remembered ages before memory. The fragments preserve hints of how this understanding slowly took hold. There are texts that speak of kings who no longer waited for divine counsel before making decisions, of priests who maintained the old rituals but no longer expected the old responses, of scribes who recorded their own observations of the heavens, no longer copying from ancient tablets but making fresh marks based on what they themselves had seen. The civilization continued, but it had become in some essential way its own. We might ask where the old ones went when they withdrew. The Sumerian texts offer no clear answer, and perhaps that is intentional. Perhaps the not knowing was part of the gift. Some fragments speak cryptically of the mountain where the sun rises, others of the place beyond the seventh wall, still others of directions that seem to describe neither physical locations nor spiritual realms, but something in between. It is as if the texts are saying, they went to a place that is not meant for you to follow. They went to a distance that cannot be crossed. They went away, and that is sufficient. There are tablets, damaged and difficult to read, that seem to describe the last moments before the withdrawal became complete. These texts have a quality of waiting about them. They describe a world that had not yet realized, cities going about their business, fields being tended, children being taught the old stories, all while something fundamental shifted beneath the surface of daily life. The old ones were still remembered, still honored, still named in prayers. Would they no longer answered? Not because they had become deaf or cruel, but because they had chosen silence. Silence can be the hardest lesson. We are creatures of noise and explanation, of question and answer. To be met with silence when we call out is to be forced to sit with our own thoughts, to find answers within ourselves, rather than receiving them from without. And perhaps this was the final wisdom the old ones offered. The wisdom of their absence, the teaching that comes only when the teacher steps back far enough that the student must stand alone. The Sumerian text describe this period with a word that appears repeatedly in the fragments, a word that our translations struggle to capture fully. It means something like the waiting silence, or the quiet that listens, or the stillness that allows. It appears in contexts that suggest it was understood, not as punishment. The waiting silence before the seed breaks through soil, the quiet that listens before understanding comes, the stillness that allows growth to happen in its own time. In this waiting silence, humanity began to find its own voice. The records from this period show a gradual shift in tone and content. Earlier texts had spoken with the careful precision of students reciting lessons, of people following instructions handed down from higher sources. But as the silence deepened, as the old ones receded further into memory, the texts began to develop their own character. They asked new questions alongside successes. They recorded failures along ties. They became, slowly and without announcement, truly human documents rather than copies of older wisdom. This transformation was not immediate. The fragments suggest it took generations, perhaps many generations, and humanity to fully claim the space that had been left to them. There were times, the texts hint, when the silence felt too vast, when the weight of self-determination seemed too heavy to bear. There are records of ceremonies designed to call the old ones back, of offerings made in hope of restoration, of prayers that asked not for wisdom, but simply for the comfort of knowing that someone older and wiser was still watching. But these calls went unanswered, and eventually, the calling ceased, not because understanding grew, because humanity began to realize that the silence was not rejection but respect. That to answer those calls would be to undo everything the withdrawal had been meant to accomplish. That the old ones remained silent, not because they did not care, but because they cared enough to let go completely. There are fragments that seem to describe a moment, or perhaps a gradual realization spread across many moments. When this understanding crystallized, when the priests stopped waiting for divine intervention and began to trust their own judgment. When the farmers stopped seeking cosmetic observations, when the scribes stopped copying ancient tablets and began to record their own present, their own history, their own slowly unfolding story. This moment, if we can call it that, marks something profound in the fragments. It is not the moment when the overtime, in ways that defy precise marking. It is the moment when humanity stopped waiting for their return, when the silence ceased to be a wound and became instead a foundation, when absence transformed from loss into liberty. The tablets from this period speak differently than those that came before. They are more uncertain, yes, but also more alive. They wonder where earlier records had only confirmed. They reach toward understanding in their own fumbling human way, without the assurance that comes from having all answers provided by beings who already know. And in that reaching, in that uncertain grasping toward knowledge, something new was born. What the Sumerian records seem to preserve, in their fractured way, is not merely the memory of beings who departed, but the memory of how departure reshaped those who remained. The silence left behind was not empty space, but active presence. A presence defined by what it no longer contained, by the voices it no longer echoed, by the guidance it no longer offered. And in that peculiar presence of absence, humanity learned to hear its own thoughts, not the divine visions of earlier ages, when gods walked through sleep to deliver messages and omens, but quieter dreams, human dreams. Dreams of empty halls in great structures that may have existed only in memory. Dreams of walking through cities where everything stood in perfect order, yet no one remained to explain the purpose of the buildings, the meaning of the symbols carved into stone, the function of the great mechanisms that stood silent and still. These dreams, recorded carefully in the old Weg script, carried a quality of searching, of wandering through inherited spaces, trying to understand not what had been lost but what had been given. There is a particular tablet, broken across its middle, found among the ruins of a temple library, that describes such a dream in detail that feels almost painful in its precision. The dreamer walks through a hall of 7 doors, each door opening onto a room filled with light, but empty of any living presence. In each room, there are objects: a basin of water that never stills, a lamp that burns without consuming oil, a tablet covered in writing that shifts and changes as you read it. The dreamer understands, in the way of dreams, that these objects are lessons. But there is no teacher to explain them, no voice to interpret their meaning. The dreamer must simply observe, must simply sit with the mystery of them, must accept that understanding may come or may not come, but that the waiting itself is part of what is being taught. The tablet breaks off before the dream concludes, and we will never know what revelation, if any, came to the dreamer in that 7th room. But perhaps that incompleteness is fitting. Perhaps the lesson of the withdrawal was precisely this: that not all questions have answers waiting to be discovered, that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, that wisdom sometimes means sitting comfortably with not knowing. In the generations following the withdrawal, the Sumerian cities continued to function. This is important to understand. The departure of the old ones did not bring collapse. The fields did not fail. The rivers did not cease their cycles. The sun continued its journey across the sky, and the moon continued to mark the months. Everything that sustained life continued. But now it continued without the assurance of divine maintenance, without the safety net of beings who could intervene when human judgment failed, and human judgment did fail, as the records honestly preserve. There were years when the planting happened at the wrong time, when the reading of omens led to poor decisions, when the management of the irrigation canals caused floods instead of preventing them. The texts from this period do not hide these failures. They record them with a kind of careful attention that earlier records perhaps would not have permitted, because these failures were now fully human failures, owned completely, without the ability to blame or petition higher powers. And in owning them, in learning from them, in adjusting and trying again, he may not have possessed before. The capacity for self-correction, born not from divine guidance, but from accumulated experience. The fragments preserve what might be called a shift in responsibility. In the older texts, when disaster struck, it was interpreted as divine displeasure, cosmic imbalance, the result of rituals improperly performed or offerings insufficiently generous. But in the Tamil for practical causes, they were analyzed, discussed, learned from. The rivers flooded not because the gods were angry, but because the canals had been poorly maintained. The harvest failed not because of cosmic disfavor, but because the seeds had been planted in soil that was too saline, too depleted. The shift seems subtle in the fragments, but it represents something profound. The movement from a world governed by divine whim to a world operating by principles that could be observed, understood, and eventually mastered. This is not to say that the Sumerians abandoned their gods, or ceased their worship, or forgot the old ones who had withdrawn. The temples remained. The festivals continued. The names of the Anunnaki were still invoked in prayers, and recorded in king lists and spoken in rituals that had been performed for so many generations, that no one remembered their origins. But the quality of the relationship, the gods became in some way more distant, and yet more intimately woven into the fabric of daily life. They were no longer the active managers of cosmic affairs, but rather the distant memories of a time when such management had been necessary. They became perhaps what we might call ancestors, honored, remembered, learned from, but not expected to intervene in the ongoing life of their descendants. There are texts that describe ceremonies of remembrance performed annually in the great temples, where the priests would recite the names of the old ones and speak of the time before the silence. These ceremonies were not petitions for return. They were not attempts to breach the distance that had been established. They were, instead, acknowledgments. Thank you for what you built. Thank you for what you taught. Thank you for leaving when you did, for trusting us with what you left behind. Thank you for the silence that allowed us to find our own voices. This gratitude for absence is perhaps the strangest element preserved in the fragments. We are accustomed to mythologies of resentment, of children angry at parents who departed, of peoples cursing gods who abandoned them. But the Sumerian texts suggest something different. The slow-growing appreciation for what the withdrawal had made possible. Not immediately, perhaps, not in the first generations when the silence still felt like loss, but gradually, as humanity settled into its independence, as it learned to trust its own judgment, the withdrawal came to be understood not as abandonment, but as graduation. The old ones had been teachers, and like all good teachers, they had known when to step back. They had known that there comes a point when continued presence becomes hindrance rather than help, when the student must be allowed to fail without rescue, to struggle without intervention, to discover that they possess resources they never knew they had, because they had never been required to use them. The withdrawal, seen through this lens, was not the ending of a relationship, but its transformation. From dependence to independence, from instruction to inheritance, from childhood to fragments suggest, was harder and lonelier than childhood had been, but also richer. Humanity now owned its achievements in a way it never had before. The cities they built were truly theirs, not copies of divine blueprints, but structures that emerged from human needs and human creativity. The knowledge they accumulated was hard-won, earned through observation and experiment, rather than received as revelation. The stories they told began to center themselves, their own deeds and struggles and triumphs, rather than simply recounting the greater deeds of the old ones who had come before. There is a poignancy in reading these texts with the understanding that they represent a civilization coming into its own. The scribes who pressed these marks into clay were doing something their ancestors had never done. They were creating a purely human history. They were recording a world in which humanity was the primary actor, the maker of decisions, the bearer of consequences. The old ones still haunted the edges of their texts, appearing in formulas and formalities, in the standardized openings of official documents, in the ritual language that preceded legal pronouncements. But they had become formulaic, traditional, the inherited vocabulary of a people who had learned to speak for themselves. Perhaps the entire arc of their presence seemed the distant ages when they had walked openly upon the earth. Through the long centuries of teaching and guidance, to the final withdrawal into silence, had been shaped toward this single goal, that humanity should one day stand on its own, should one day look at the world not as a garden tended by higher beings, but as a field they themselves must cultivate with all the risk and reward that such responsibility entails. The fragments do not say this explicitly. They cannot. The understanding came too slowly, spread across too many generations, emerged too gradually from lived experience to be captured in any single pronouncement. But it runs through the text like a current beneath the surface, a recognition that grows clearer the further we move from the moment of withdrawal. The old ones left because it was time, because humanity was ready, even if it did not yet know it was ready. Because the only way to discover one's own strength is to be required to use it, without the assurance that someone stronger stands ready to intervene. And so the record shifted, generation by generation, from accounts that look backward to the time of the gods, to accounts that look forward into the uncertain human future. The fragments preserve this shift not as a sudden break, but as a gradual reorientation, a slow turning from what had been given to what might yet be created, from inheritance to innovation, from memory to imagination. In the silence that followed the withdrawal, something unexpected began to emerge in the Sumerian records. Not despair as one might anticipate from a people bereft of their divine guides, but a kind of quiet confidence that seems almost strange. The scribes wrote of their cities with a new possessiveness, referring to our walls and our canals, in ways that earlier texts had not. They recorded innovations in irrigation, in agriculture, in the organization of labor, not as the limitations of divine instruction, but as solutions they themselves had devised. The shift is subtle in any single tablet, but across the span of generations, it becomes unmistakable. Humanity was claiming ownership of its own civilization. There are fragments that describe what we might call experiments, attempts to solve problems through a trial of divine principles. One badly damaged tablet speaks of a farmer who tried planting barley in a new pattern, not because tradition demanded it, or because a priest had received instruction in a dream, but because he had noticed how water flowed differently across different sections of his field. Another fragment records a craftsman who altered the traditional method of bronze working, producing stronger tools through a process he had discovered by accident, and then refined through repeated attempts. These are small moments, preserved almost by chance in the archaeological record, but they represent something profound, the beginning of human innovation. The old ones, in their presence, had provided answers. In their absence, they had created space for questions, and humanity, it seems, was a creature that thrived on questions. The fragments from this period are full of them, questions about why some years brought abundance, and others brought scarcity. Questions about how to build higher, to irrigate more efficiently, to organize society more effectively. Not all of these questions were answered. Many could not be answered with the knowledge available. But the asking itself became a kind of activity that defined the age, an age of inquiry rather than acceptance. This is not to suggest that the Sumerian civilization of this period abandoned its religious foundations, or ceased to honor the sacred. The temples, if anything, grew more elaborate. The priestly class maintained its authority and expanded its influence. The festivals of the gods were celebrated with increasing complexity and grandeur, but the nature of the religious observance had changed in a way that the fragments only barely articulate. The gods were still honored, but they were honored as one honors those who have departed, rather than those who actively govern. The rituals became commemorations of relationship rather than petitions for intervention. The prayers became expressions of remembrance rather than requests for assistance. There is a particular hymn, preserved in multiple copies across different sites, that captures this transformation. It is addressed to the old ones collectively, not naming them individually, but speaking to them as a group, as a presence that once was. The hymn does not ask them to return. It does not lament their departure. Instead, it thanks them for the silence they have given, for the emptiness they have left behind, for the space within which humanity has learned to stand. The language is formal, ritualized, but beneath the formulaic phrases there runs a genuine emotion that feels almost modern in its complexity. That mixture of gratitude and grief, of confidence and uncertainty, of pride in what has been accomplished and awareness of how much has been lost. The hymn ends with a line that appears in various forms in many texts from this period. "You taught us by leaving." It is a remarkable statement preserved in the oldest written language we possess, suggesting that even in that distant age, humanity had grasped a truth that we still struggle with. That some lessons can only be learned in the absence of the teacher, that some growth can only happen in the space created by withdrawal, that the greatest gift a guide can give is ultimately their departure. As the centuries passed and the silence deepened, the old ones began to take on a different quality in Sumerian memory. They became gradually more mythical and less historical. The text stopped speaking of them as beings who had walked the earth within remembered time, and began to speak of them as figures from the deep past. From the time before time, from the age when the world was young and different. This shift may represent an actual forgetting, a fading of genuine historical memory into legend. Or it may represent something more deliberate, the choice to allow the old ones to recede into myth, to become symbols rather than remembered individuals, to transform from departed teachers into timeless principles. The fragments suggest both processes were at work. Some texts preserve detailed genealogies connecting the old ones to specific cities and specific dynasties, maintaining a kind of historical continuity even as other aspects of memory faded. Other texts spoke of them in increasingly abstract terms, as embodiments of wisdom, of order, of the principles that governed existence itself. They became in these more philosophical texts, less like beings who had once existed, and more like eternal truths that humanity had been privileged to encounter directly in ages past, but now could only approach through reason and observation. This transformation of memory may itself have been part of what the withdrawal was meant to accomplish. As long as the old ones were remembered too clearly, too specifically, too historically, humanity might continue to look backward to their time as a golden age to be restored, rather than forward to possibilities to be created. But as memory softened into myth, as history blurred into symbol, the old ones could serve a different function. They could become not a past to return to, but a foundation to build upon, not a standard against which the present was measured and found wanting, but a beginning from which the present had grown and would continue to grow. The fragments preserve another shift that accompanied this transformation of memory, a change in how knowledge itself was understood and transmitted. In the earliest texts, knowledge was presented as revelation, as wisdom handed down from the old ones through priestly intermediaries. But as the silence lengthened, knowledge began to be understood as something that could be discovered, tested, refined. The scribal schools of this later period produced texts that read very differently from their predecessors. They contain observations of natural phenomena, records of astronomical events, collections not by divine attribution, but by observed effectiveness, mathematical calculations developed not from revealed principles, but from fragment of fields, the calculation of grain storage, the division of inheritance. This represents a fundamental shift in epistemology, though the Sumerian scribes who lived through it probably did not think of it in such abstract terms. For them, it was simply the necessary adaptation to living in a world where divine instruction was no longer available. If you could not ask the gods how much grain would be needed to feed the city through winter, you had to develop methods of calculation based on past experience and present observation. If you could not petition for healing through ritual alone, you had to experiment with herbs and treatments, and keep records of what worked and what failed. Knowledge became by necessity empirical rather than revelatory, and in becoming empirical, it became something that could grow, that could accumulate across generations, that could improve through careful attention and honest acknowledgement of error. The fragments from this period show scribes comparing different treatments for the same illness, noting which worked better, under which circumstances. They show mathematicians developing new methods for old problems, not because the old methods were wrong, but because the new methods were more efficient or more elegant. They show astronomers tracking the movements of the planets with increasing precision, not to divine the will of the gods, but simply to understand the patterns themselves, to map the heavens as one might map the earth. Has a territory to be known rather than a mystery to be feared. This gradual accumulation of empirical knowledge represented, in its own way, a conversation with the absent old ones. Each discovery, each refinement, each new understanding was both a demonstration of human capability and an honoring of the foundation the old ones had laid. They had given humanity the tools, writing, number, the basic techniques of agriculture and construction, and then they had stepped back to see what humanity would build with those tools. And humanity, it seems, built more than perhaps even the old ones had anticipated. Not because humans were greater than their teachers, but because they were free from the burden of comparison, free to make mistakes that divine beings might never have made, free to explore paths that perfect wisdom might have recognized as inefficient but that led, sometimes, to unexpected discoveries. There is a math illustrates this beautifully. It contains a problem and 3 different solutions, all arrived at by different methods. The scribe has worked through each method, carefully showing the calculations, and at the end has noted which method is fastest, which is most reliable, which is easiest to teach to students. There is no claim that any method came from divine revelation. There is no appeal to ancient authority. There is simply the quiet confidence of someone who has worked through a problem, found multiple paths to its solution, and evaluate each path on its merits. It is in its way a profoundly human document, and it exists only because the old ones were not there to provide a single authoritative answer. The silence, as it stretched across the centuries, became a kind of companion to the Sumerian people, not something they struggled against or sought to fill with noise, but something they learned to move within, to carry with them, to accept as the condition of their existence. The fragments from the later periods speak of it differently than the earlier texts had, where the first generations after the withdrawal had described silence as an absence, something missing, something lost. The later texts speak of it almost as a presence in itself, a teacher that instructed through withholding, a guide that pointed the way by refusing to speak. There are philosophical fragments from this time scattered across various tablets that attempt to articulate what the silence meant. One text, preserved only in part, speaks of silence as the space where thought grows. Another describes it as the emptiness that allows form to appear. These are abstract formulations, perhaps, but they suggest a sophisticated understanding of what the withdrawal had accomplished. The old ones had not simply left humanity alone. They had created the conditions necessary for humanity to discover itself, and discovery requires emptiness, empty space to move into, empty silence to fill with new voices, empty canvas upon which to make marks that are genuinely original rather than copies of what came before. In this silence, Sumerian culture flourished in ways that may not have been possible under the continued presence of the old ones. Art became more varied, more experimental. The cylinder seals of this period show scenes that earlier seals had not depicted. Daily life, human relationships, moments of celebration and mourning that have nothing to do with the gods or cosmic order. Literature emerged that was concerned with human questions, human struggles, human achievement. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its various versions and fragments, stands as perhaps the greatest testament to this shift. It is a story fundamentally about human limitation, human mortality, human striving against the boundaries of existence. The gods appear in it, yes, but they are distant, capricious, ultimately unhelpful. The real drama unfolds between human beings. And the real questions it asks are questions only humans can answer. How should we live knowing we will die? What makes a life worth living? What can we leave behind that will outlast our brief time? These are not questions that need divine intervention to answer. They are questions that arise precisely because divine intervention is no longer available. They are questions born from silence, from the necessity of finding meaning in a world where higher beings no longer provide ready-made significance. And in grappling with these questions, in creating stories and poems and philosophical reflections around them, the Sumerians were doing something the old ones perhaps could never have done for them. They were creating a distinctly human culture, a way of understanding existence that emerged from human experience. The fragments preserve moments when this realization seems to have crystallized. Moments when scribes, or priests, or poets suddenly grasped what the silence had given them. There is a tablet, damaged but still legible, during which a priest speaks to the assembled people about the nature of the withdrawal. He does not lament it. He does not pray for the old ones to return. Instead, he speaks of it as a blessing that took generations to recognize. They loved us enough to leave. The text records him saying, "They trusted us enough to be silent. They believed in what we might become more than in what we had been." This understanding that the withdrawal was an act of love rather than abandonment, of trust rather than rejection, seems to have taken root gradually in Sumerian consciousness. It appears in fragments from different periods, in different cities, in different contexts, suggesting it was not the insight of a single individual, but a realization. The old ones had given humanity its greatest gift, not by their presence, but by their absence. Not by answering questions, but by creating the necessity to ask them. Not by solving problems, but by establishing the conditions under which problem solving could become a human activity. And yet, even as this understanding grew, the fragments suggest that humanity never quite lost its awareness of what had been sacrificed. The silence was productive, yes, but it was also genuinely a loss. The texts do not pretend otherwise. There are laments scattered throughout the later Sumerian corpus that speak of longing for the old days, for the time when wisdom was certain and guidance was clear, when humanity did not have to struggle alone with questions too large for mortal minds to fully grasp. These laments are not dominant. They do not represent the main thrust of Sumerian thought in this period. They are present, honest acknowledgments that even necessary losses are still losses, that even beneficial changes still require grief. This honesty about loss, this refusal to pretend that independence came without cost, may be one of the most profound aspects of what the fragments preserve. The Sumerians did not create a triumphalist narrative in which humanity was better off without the old ones. They created instead a more complex story, one that held both gratitude for what the withdrawal had made possible and genuine sorrow for what it had taken away. Both could be true simultaneously. The silence could be both liberation and loneliness. As the centuries continued to pass, as the Sumerian civilization itself moved toward its own eventual transformation and absorption into later empires, the memory of the old ones continued to evolve. In the latest fragments, they have become almost entirely mythical, that their actual historical existence seems less important than what they represent. They are invoked in the formulaic openings of texts as a kind of traditional authority, but there is little sense that anyone expects them to be listening, to be present, to be anything other than memory. And perhaps this final fading into pure symbol represents the completion of what the withdrawal began. The old ones had stepped back physically, removing their presence from the world. Then they had stepped back from memory, allowing themselves to become less historical and more mythical. And finally, they had stepped back even from myth, becoming mere convention, mere formula, mere inherited phrases that scribes copied, because that was how texts had always begun, not because anyone still believed those ancient names carried power or presence. This complete withdrawal me foral, moralist, semple, fulmenamida. The old ones had not simply left the stage, they had dismantled the stage itself, had dissolved even the memory of the stage, until humanity stood not in a space once occupied by gods, but simply in the world, its world, the only world it had ever truly possessed. The silence had become so complete, so thorough, that it was no longer even recognized as silence. It was simply the normal condition of existence. The absence had become so total that it was no longer felt as absence. It was simply reality. The fragments give us glimpses of this final stage of the withdrawal, texts that speak of the gods in purely formal terms, with no expectation of response or intervention. Prayers that are performed because they have always been performed, not because anyone believes they will be answered. Rituals maintained, not because they connect the human to the divine, but because they connect the present to the past, because they provide continuity and tradition, and a sense of rootedness in time. The gods, including the old ones who had first withdrawn, had become komaris, echoes of echoes, and in becoming artifacts, they had finally given humanity what perhaps they had intended to give all along. Complete freedom, freedom from the burden of divine expectation, freedom from the comparison to beings who were greater, wiser, more powerful, freedom to be simply and entirely human, with all the limitation. The old ones, in choosing silence, in choosing withdrawal, in choosing to fade even from memory and myth into mere convention, had granted humanity the most profound gift any teacher can give: the right to forget the teacher and claim the knowledge as one own. The latest Sumerian fragments show a civilization fully mature in this freedom. They speak confidently of human achievement. They record with precision human knowledge. They plan for human futures. The old ones appear, when they appear at all, as distant ancestors, whose contributions are acknowledged in formulaic ways, but whose continuing influence is no longer felt, no longer needed. Humanity had learned to walk alone, so thoroughly that it no longer remembered ever having needed assistance. The silence had become so natural that it was no longer heard as silence, no longer recognized as the space left by departed teachers, but simply as the quiet in which human voices could speak clearly and be heard. And so the records tell us, in their fragmentary way, of a departure that was also an arrival, of a silence that spoke more clearly than voices ever had, of an absence that gave more than presence ever could. The old ones, whoever and whatever they may have been, chose to step back from the world they had shaped, and in doing so they allowed that world to become something they could never have made it: truly human. We who read these fragments now, across the vast distance of millennia, can only wonder at what we find preserved in them. Not the story we expected of gods and their glories, not the usual mythology of divine intervention and human subjugation, but something stranger and more tender. A story of beings who understood that the highest form of teaching is to make oneself unnecessary, who knew that love sometimes requires distance, who recognized that the greatest gift they could give was their departure. Perhaps they are still silent wherever they went. Perhaps the silence was not temporary, a waiting before return, but permanent, a condition they chose as final and complete as any ending can be. Perhaps they withdrew not just from Sumer, not just from the river valleys and the early cities, but from the world entire, from time itself, stepping back into a distance so profound that no human longing could ever bridge it, no human memory ever truly reach it. Or perhaps the silence was always meant to be broken, but not by them. Perhaps they withdrew so that humanity could one day fill the quiet they left behind with voices strong enough, wise enough, mature enough to speak without needing to be taught each word. Perhaps they wait in whatever place the fragments could not name, not to return but simply to listen, to hear what their students have become in the long ages of silence, to witness, from their incomprehensible distance, what grows in gardens no longer tended, what rises in spaces no longer occupied, what beauty emerges when the old teachers finally trust their students enough to leave them completely alone. The Sumerian tablet, pressed into clay by hands long returned to dust, preserve this possibility. They whisper across time, not that the gods abandoned their creation, but that they loved it enough to let it go. That they trusted humanity with a gift so profound, we are still, millennia later, learning to understand it. The gift of our own becoming, unguided and uncertain, lonely and free. The records fell silent, because those who kept them learned, slowly and across generations. That silence was not emptiness, but space. Not absence, but allowance. Not ending, but beginning. The old ones withdrew, and in withdrawing they taught their final lesson, that the deepest wisdom is not found in answers received, but in questions we learn to ask ourselves. In the quiet spaces where our own voices, hesitant at first but growing stronger, begin at last to speak, and in that speaking, we honor the silence that made it possible.